Hi everybody, welcome back to English 90. This happens to be for our class for Wednesday the 22nd. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our first chapter in the textbook, Introduction to Writing, and I also wanted to talk about journals, which is going to be your upcoming writing assignment. So basically, in terms of that first chapter in our textbook, which would be pages 2 through 23, it talks a little bit about some of the introductory elements associated with writing. And there are 4 elements associated with writing that we are going to be focusing on over the course of the semester. The first is that you need to have a clearly stated point. That's oftentimes known as a thesis. What is the major point or argument that you are making in your particular piece of writing? Usually it's something that can be stated in a sentence or 2. Secondly, do you have detailed support or evidence? Basically, my job is to take the opposite perspective of whatever it is you happen to be saying. So what you need to do is to provide enough evidence so that a reader, or in this instance, I could accept your position as a possibility. And then you need to organize and connect your support and evidence. And then finally, you need to spend some time revising and editing, proofreading. And the text also talks about some of the differences between writing and talking. Talking tends to be rather informal, and writing tends to be formal. Certainly it depends on the kind of writing that you're doing. So if you're writing on social media or in an email, you might be more informal. But the kind of writing that we're talking about is academic writing, or also the writing that you would expect to do in the business world. So there are usually certain conventions and certain expectations that are associated with that. So the first element that the text and I wanted to talk about in relation to writing is the idea of a paragraph, which you may already have some familiarity with. And actually this is on page 4, and you can see this in the notes below, where it talks about what a paragraph is. And basically what a paragraph includes is an opening sentence, usually it's the first sentence, that's known as a topic sentence. This serves as a kind of summary for the paragraph. Now remember, we were talking about reading skills, and I suggested that if something was well written, you could read the first sentence of each paragraph and basically get a kind of summary. So you want to do that in terms of your own writing, that for the most part, you want your paragraphs to have opening sentences, topic sentences that serve as a kind of summary of what your paragraph is about. Then you need to have supporting sentences, evidence. You need to have some sort of proof. Again, sort of thinking that the reader is going to be taking the opposite position of what you're taking. So you need to provide evidence or proof, much like a lawyer might do in a courtroom. And then you need to have some sort of a concluding sentence in your paragraph, some sort of a last sentence that sort of gives a sense of closure or ending to that particular paragraph before you begin your next paragraph. And basically each paragraph deals with a main idea. So this is where you decide on how to divide up your paragraphs. And this will be dependent on your opening sentence. So your opening sentence will indicate what that main idea is, and then that paragraph should address that particular main idea. Paragraphs also help the reader when they are reading, because it helps to break up text. So the idea of what a paragraph looks like, most of us have a general sense just because of the paragraphs that we have experienced over the course of our own reading. And that usually a paragraph is several inches in depth. You don't want probably a paragraph that is too short, but you also don't want to have a paragraph that's too long and dense, because it's difficult to read all of that text. So you can think about it from a practical standpoint in that way, is how much information can a reader absorb, and that might help make a determination as to what you want to make your topic sentence for that particular paragraph. Now a paragraph, because it has a topic sentence, it has at least some kind of support, and it has a concluding sentence. That means it must be a minimum of 3 sentences. Anything less than 3 sentences is not considered an academic paragraph. And I'm quite aware that you can read sentences in journalism, for instance, that are shorter, but again, we're not talking about journalistic writing, we're talking about academic writing or the writing of business. So minimum 3 sentences but probably much longer than that. There's a template on page 10 that you might want to take a peek at in terms of the diagram for writing a paragraph, and especially the diagram for writing an essay. And you can see in the notes below that an essay includes having an introductory paragraph, which means it's one paragraph that's just devoted to introducing the idea of what it is you're going to be talking about. This is where you have your thesis statement, your central idea. And then you have a body paragraph or body paragraphs, and this is where you have your pieces of evidence. And usually we suggest three, that you have three or more pieces of evidence. So if you were going to devote a paragraph to each of those pieces of evidence, and you had three pieces of evidence, you would have three body paragraphs. And then you would have a concluding paragraph, which basically is an entire paragraph, topic sentence, supporting sentence, and concluding sentence, that's devoted to basically tying things up, giving a sense of closure or a summary statement. This is what we call an essay, and oftentimes we call a paper. Now, in terms of what we are going to be doing in this class is that in addition to talking about the initial steps of writing in more depth, about making sure that you've got a thesis and that you've got support and that you are connecting your support and your revising and editing, we're going to begin with the first basic building block of writing, a paragraph. And then what we're going to do is expand that into an essay or a paper. So, but that's going to be over the course of a semester. And something else that the readings talk about that I think is much oftentimes ignored in writing, just like it's much oftentimes ignored in reading, is that reading is a process and writing is a process. So if you'll remember last class, we talked about the stages of reading, that rather than trying to read something in its entirety and try to understand it, we should do some previewing and some pre-reading, and we should do some skimming and try to get a sense as to what some of the major elements are before we actually read it. It should be the same with writing. Now, if you'll remember, I gave you a writing sample in class, and it was non-graded, and I wanted you to either select one of two topics to either talk about why you enrolled in English 90 and what did you hope to learn, in part because that could be useful information to me. Or if you didn't want to do that, you could do something a little bit more creative and talk about the most blank experience I had this year was blank. And then you could fill in the blanks. And I didn't give you any specific format or guidelines. I didn't want to. I just wanted to see what you could produce without any kind of advice or interference from me. And what I would have done is return that to you via your email. I asked you to send that to me via my email so I could use my grading program so that I could write comments. And basically, since I didn't grade it, I just basically welcomed you all to the class. But I just wanted to get a very quick view of what the class as a whole looked like in terms of their writing. But my suspicion is that you probably, when you received that assignment, that you began writing immediately rather than thinking about writing as a process. And usually you get a much better piece of writing when you're writing as a process. And what does writing as a process mean? And this is section 5 of the notes below. That means that first you try to brainstorm, you generate ideas. You don't write, you just think. You might perhaps want to write down some of these ideas in a list format, but basically what you're not trying to do is to write sentences or write paragraphs. So a sentence basically is a group of words that expresses a complete idea. And then these sentences together are what makes up a paragraph. And then paragraphs together are what make up an essay or a paper. But basically, just first trying to generate the ideas and not worry about language or how to express things. Then you can begin drafting or writing. And then you can revise and make changes so that ultimately it can be following some of the grammatical expectations of what we assume would be for an academic paper or for the world of business. And then finally, the editing or the proofreading, the polishing or the refining before you actually hand it in. And in fact, for the editing and proofreading, I have a suggestion that when you get to that stage that you actually read out loud what you've written, because you can oftentimes hear when things don't sound correct. You may not be able to articulate why there's an error, but you may be able to understand or hear that there's an error and be able to correct it. And unless you're an English teacher, you don't really necessarily have to have the language as to what the mistake is. That said, we will talk a little bit about language and trying to identify errors over the course of the semester. But what's most important is that you can either avoid errors, or you can find a way to eliminate those errors within your sentences as you are writing. So the text also talks about something called the MLA, which stands for the Modern Language Association. This is the professional association that English teachers belong to and English professors. They're the ones who come up with the rules about grammar and mechanics, and also how to quote and how to document those quotes, how to indicate where those quotes are coming from. So we'll be talking about the MLA over the course of the semester. But the first chapter talks a little bit about some of the MLA guidelines about formatting, what a paper or a piece of writing is supposed to look like. And this is on page 18. And some of the general conventions are that you're supposed to, when you are typing, double space. And this is something that you can select in your ruler. Basically what it does is that it gives a blank line in between each of your typed lines, space for a teacher to write comments, for instance. Usually what we expect are 1-inch margins around the sides of your writing. Again, it's giving room for a teacher to write comments. And that the typeset that you're using is either 11 or 12 point. That's considered to be standard. And there are lots of options you can use with type. I prefer Times New Roman. I think that's what the suggestion is in your textbook as well. You just don't want to use a type that in one way or another seems unusual. You don't want to use calligraphy or something of that nature. You want to use a typeset that basically would be something that you would be expecting to see in a typical textbook. So this gives you an idea of how it is that you should type up your assignments when you are writing, which leads us to the first writing assignment. If you'll remember, I had indicated that we have these journals that we are going to be doing over the course of the semester. And actually on page 14 of your textbook, you can see that they talk a little bit about journals in the sense that you might want to do a kind of journal or diary of your own, just to practice your own writing skills and writing about whatever happens to interest you at that particular point in time. But just so that you get in the practice of writing. Our class journals are going to be a little bit more specific in that I am going to be focusing on wellness. And if you'll remember, I talked a little bit about this in the beginning of the semester, that in the past, what I've done with journals is I've let students choose their own topic of interest and then basically find readings based on that topic of interest and to write about it. But considering these unusual times that we happen to be in, I thought that we may as well talk about the connection between mind and body wellness and what I call the elephant in the room. The reality is that we are all dealing with the reality of COVID right now. So we may as well address that head on. So what I'm going to be doing is, rather than asking you to select articles of your own to read, I'm going to be providing you with articles to read that are in one way or another related to mind and body wellness. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is to summarize those articles that I provide to you and then analyze or respond to those articles. You remember last class we talked a little bit about the idea of summarizing, coming up with the main ideas of something. And that's usually a very major skill in college, where you've got a good amount of reading, where you want to try to condense it to the main points. But rather than start with a book that you have to condense to main points, I wanted to start you with things that were shorter, such as articles that you could condense to main points and supporting details. And I also wanted you to not just be able to summarize it, but also to respond to it, to give your own thoughts or reflections about that as well. And this would also be an opportunity for you to write sentences and also to write paragraphs, so that I could begin to look at your sentences and paragraphs and begin to give you feedback. Even though we haven't talked about grammar, for instance, yet, though we will be in the next few weeks, I can certainly make commentary about grammar as you're beginning to write now. So those were the ideas behind the journals, and that you would be doing that over the course of the semester, as well as writing some formal papers. And we can talk a little bit about some of those formal writing assignments as the semester progresses. But your first journal I had scheduled due for this upcoming Monday, the 27th. And what I did was I selected an article that actually the GCC Wellness Center has posted that I thought would be of use to all of us to read. It's entitled Grief and COVID-19, Mourning Our Bygone Lives. And it talks a little bit about some of the strategies we can engage in to improve our mental health during these very challenging times. So you can see that in the notes below, I've included a link to that. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to access that link and to read that particular article. And for your first journal, which will be due on Monday, the 27th, that you summarize that article as well as give your response to it. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can summarize. Whether or not you want to think about the 5 W's of journalism, if you've ever heard of this before, the 5 W's of journalism are who, what, when, where, and why. So these are questions you can basically ask yourself when you're reading something and try to answer them in your summary. Who are we talking about? What are we talking about? When are we talking about it? Where is it occurring? And why is it important? Or if you wanted to think about just coming up with main idea and supporting points, whether it be through the skimming that you do through reading the opening paragraph, the opening sentences of the following paragraphs, and the concluding paragraph, or you're just trying to identify, almost in the way that you would summarize, let's say, a television program to a friend who didn't watch the program. The program might have been an hour long. Let's subtract 15 minutes or so for commercials, so we've got about a 45-minute program. But you obviously are not going to be spending 45 minutes explaining what happened during that episode. You're going to highlight the main points. But however it is that you want to go about it, to try to summarize it in fewer words. The idea of a summary is that it's shorter. And you're using your own language rather than just copying the language of the text, telling what the article was about. So somebody who is reading your summary should be able to understand what the main points were, even though they didn't read the original. And then your response, not just the summary, but what were your thoughts or reflections? And there are lots of different ways you could proceed with this. You can talk about things you agree with in the article. You could talk about things you disagree with in the article. You could talk about how the article does or does not relate to your life experiences. There are lots of different ways that you could proceed with this. Now, the length of the journals. Now, a part of this is going to be dependent on the actual length of the original article. The longer the article, the longer your summary. But most journals end up being about a page or so, where you're writing approximately a half a page or so of summary and then another half a page or so of response, give or take a little bit. But you can write as much or as little as you like. Then what I get to do is to see how well you're doing with writing a summary, and if I have suggestions, I will provide them to you. And also, I get to look at your sentences and your grammar and your mechanics and begin to give you suggestions now, even though we haven't necessarily talked about grammar and mechanics, so that when we do get to that point in the semester, you'll already have some feedback. So you'll already have a sense as to some of the places where you might want to devote your attention to. Because as you continue to write these journals, you'll probably note that I'm making similar kinds of comments. So I might be writing, for instance, that you are having problems with commas in your journals as you continue to write your journals. And that would be a clue for you to pay particular attention to the comma section when we get to that in the semester. Yet for someone else, I might be writing that what you need to watch out for are fragments. So that means that when we get to the fragment section in the semester, you want to pay particular attention to fragments. So I want, as the journals progress, for you to begin to see a pattern in your writing of what your strengths are as well as what your weaknesses are. Now, I had indicated that I'm grading the journals informally. I don't want you to worry too much about being perfect with the journals. I want you to make mistakes and have me correct them, and make the same mistake and have me correct it, and have you make the same mistake and have me correct it. In some way, it's somewhat laborious, but ultimately, if this continues to happen over the course of the semester, eventually you will decrease the number of mistakes that you are making because I've corrected them to the point where you can self-correct. So it's very similar to what might happen if you were trying to learn a bike, how to ride a bike, in that you would probably first get on the bike and fall. And that would happen several times until eventually you learned how to balance yourself. And while you might have a textbook on that teaches you on how to ride a bike, it's one thing reading about it and it's another thing doing it. It's very difficult to articulate how to balance yourself on a bike. And I think it's the same thing with writing. Our textbook is there to give you suggestions, but ultimately you're going to have to write and actually make mistakes and have those mistakes be corrected over and over before you get a sense of how to not to make those mistakes. So that was the idea behind the journals, and thus I'm not grading the journals on a letter scale. I'm grading them on a check mark scale, on either a plus is excellent, or a check plus is very good, or a check is satisfactory. And that's where most of the grades range, though there also is a check minus, less than satisfactory, and a minus, and unsatisfactory. And we'll be doing journals 6 times over the course of the semester, and this is your first journal, Grief and COVID-19, Mourning Our Bygone Lives. So again, your assignment for next class, and this will be due Monday the 27th by 11:59 p.m. to my email at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Please send via PDF because that's how my grading program works best. Basically a summary of the article that you've read and some of your responses to that. That'll be your first graded journal assignment, which again I'll briefly talk about during our Monday's class as well, because that won't be due until Monday at the very ending of the day. So our attendance question for today's class, and this will be due on Thursday the 23rd at 10 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know. We've talked about the writing process: brainstorming, drafting, revising, and proofreading. Which part of the writing process, whether it be brainstorming, coming up with ideas, drafting, beginning to write, revising, which is basically creating a document, and then ultimately proofreading, which is polishing and editing. Which do you find to be the most challenging in your own writing, and why? So that'll be today's attendance question. Again, there are no real right or wrong answers associated with that. I just want to get you to start thinking about your own experiences with writing, and of course I will respond to whatever it is that you state. And you don't need to respond to your classmates, but I do encourage you to read the responses of your classmates so that you can get a sense of class discussion. Again, the journals are very different. They're not meant for public viewing. They're just for me when you are writing your summary of the article, Grief and COVID-19, Mourning Our Bygone Lives, as well as your response to that particular article. So I hope you are all doing well. I am doing well. And we will continue on next class, and we will talk about further stages in the writing process. And we'll also start talking about some of the writing assignments that will be coming up over the course of this semester. Take care. Bye-bye.